Hello and welcome to Meet the Disruptors, 2 days of free online events exploring key market challenges brought to you by Ditto, the B2B tech marketing practice. Thank you for joining our Meet the Author showcase with fintech veteran and AI thought leader Michael Berns. I'm glad you're joining us for this discussion with Michael, who's published numerous articles and pieces, but most recently has published the book, The AI Book, the Artificial Intelligence Handbook for Investors, Entrepreneurs and Fintech Visionaries, which will be released a little later this year. More on that shortly. So let's get to some introductions. Firstly, to introduce myself, I'm Andy Reid. I'm Strategic Advisor at Delega, and it's my very great pleasure to be moderating today's session. Just on me, I've been working in the financial services industry for 23 years. Recently, I've been an interim Chief Revenue Officer at Blequin. Blequin are an AI and machine learning based fraud detection and prevention company, where I was helping with the company's early phase go-to-market efforts. So I'm particularly interested in today's conversations. Prior to that, I'd spent 20 years with Deutsche Bank in the corporate, the transaction and the digital banking areas, both in Europe and in the US, where I had a large focus on treasury and payment processing. I'm currently advising a number of businesses with their commercial strategies and activities, one of which is Delega, which again, for those who may be interested, is a project involving a consortium of global banks and corporates looking at the digitization of bank signatory authorizations. And our guest today, as mentioned, I'm delighted to be joined by a true industry heavyweight and a real subject matter expert. Michael is a director at PwC, where he leads the AI and the fintech practice. He is an AI thought leader and a fintech veteran with 17 years of international experience, having run client engagements across 5 continents. He spent more than a decade working on the compliance and risk management side of banks, insurers, and asset managers, before then disrupting that space with a number of innovative solutions. This after completing his executive MBA at the London Business School. His particular area of expertise is the design and the implementation of AI-driven solutions for global financial service institutions. Today with Michael, I'm going to look forward to chatting a little about AI. What is it? Why does it matter? And where is it going? So very good afternoon to you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be moderating today, and thank you for taking part in the discussion. Now, a quick note to the audience. Thank you. A quick note to the audience, this webinar is being recorded and you can enter any questions you have into the chat in the GoToWebinar side panel, and I would really encourage you to do so. We will be stopping the session at 1:40, at which point we'll encourage you all to take part in the digital hangout taking place at ditto.tv/mtd. Now, just to explain the format briefly, to start the afternoon, we'll get straight into the topic in a minute, and particularly I'm going to ask Michael to just give an insight into his career journey and the work that's gone into the books and the articles that he's put into, as well as some of the official studies he's been working on. We're going to go through a range of questions, and as I've mentioned, I'd love to get some of your input from an audience Q&A perspective. Thereafter, we'll drop into the digital hangout for any questions that you would thereafter like to explore in a bit more detail. So, as mentioned, we have a veteran from the AI world on the line with us today. He's authored the book, The AI Book, the Artificial Intelligence Handbook for Investors, Entrepreneurs and Fintech Visionaries, where his very specific chapter, RoboCop on Wall Street, will be taking place, and that book will be coming out a little bit later this year. Within that, he reflects upon his own hands-on experience implementing numerous AI projects across leading global institutions over the last 7 years. Through these insights, investors, visionaries, entrepreneurs, all of those who may be interested will gain a great insight into the application of artificial intelligence. So again, after that introduction, Michael, a very warm welcome, and I'd love to just kick off the conversation today. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your career journey today and specifically how it is that you've come to be running such a key practice at PwC and really in what has to be one of the hottest technology spaces.
Thank you, Andy. It's a pleasure to be here. My old CTO in my last firm, focusing on AI, he would have said, in God we trust, everybody else must bring data. And yeah, in true style, my journey has been one of data. Some 15 years ago, I worked at Moody's KMB. The KMB part were free quants in a warehouse looking at the world's largest pile of default data, trying to derive some models with linear regression and trying to come up with new insights based on masses of data. Back then we were called financial services. Moody's acquired us. We're then integrated into Moody's Analytics. But it was kind of like the beginning of my journey in terms of fintech for me, that then led to Morgan Stanley, MSCI, Wolters Kluwer, and a number of other leading firms in the risk and compliance segment. And it was more some of the lessons from the financial crisis, from that just having one view and having a more accurate calculation of back then value at risk, or some of the credit risk modeling only got you so far that there had to be a new approach. And that's something that I really followed also in my journey through the executive MBA, where I was inspired by many entrepreneurs in the class, and also the venture capitalists, that dialogue between startups and people who are financing them in terms of 99 reasons not to succeed. Yeah, this was some of the challenges that led me to mentor startups, first with Virgin Money, Startup Bootcamp, and many other organizations for some 9 years. And it was through that channel, which I did in my free time in terms of mentoring, that I got exposed to some of the really innovative players in terms of AI, coming right from Silicon Valley into Europe via London, and kind of using me to help them to with their go-to-market model, with their first contacts. And then the more I saw this solution, the more fascinated I was to eventually join those companies. And that I later did. So some 7 years ago, I joined first a big data company, then towards machine learning, and then AI. And yes, for some personal reasons, I'm now based in Frankfurt, where I started my career some 20 years ago before I left for London and worked globally. But you know, we all have our reasons, and I'm trying to help PwC as a company to see the full potential of AI, but I'm also working on digital solutions for clients to help them realizing that, at least for Germany and German-speaking part, we are still at the beginning of realizing that potential.
Interesting. So it's been quite a circuitous journey, but one where you've almost come full circle, arriving back in Germany and picking up the mantle there with the experience you've gained, which is interesting. So one of the things, and I want to just jump straight into it in terms of the artificial intelligence element of this. So I mean, looking into this and being exposed to this myself, there's seemingly endless ways to define what AI is and how to categorize different types and levels of AI, depending on how closely the technology maps and marries human behavior almost. So, I mean, how would you set this out for our listeners as we approach this conversation here?
I myself, I'm a very visual person, so to make it visible for the listeners is not always the easiest thing, but I'm giving a shot. The fact is, and that goes for when you think about financial services or capital markets as well, that there is a lot of jargon that gets reused in different contexts and drives different meaning. So sometimes when you are working within it, you can feel that people are using certain terminology and maybe not always to really make a different statement, but rather say, oh, we are doing this and the rest of the world is just doing this. So for me, a very high level then, and we could go into very detailed Venn diagrams that would essentially show that there's a huge overlap between the words, but let's start at high level. And high level, we've got the general AI, like the full blown human-like system that is a lot of theorized about. You would have Elon Musk, you would have Stephen Hawking, many other people commenting on some horror scenarios for that. But somehow most people in the field acknowledge that we are at least 10, if not 20 years away from a human-like interface. And it seems not very much moving. So like with the fusion reactors or other futuristic tech, it always feels like we are 10 years away from it. And you would see the same if you would look like at the Gartner hype cycle for AI. Certain topics are just not moving, let's say, closer in. But then you have the narrow AI. And you can then argue, is machine learning AI? For me, it is. For a lot of practitioners, it also is. But it's a strand of it. And then you can go into more detail in terms of different flavors of that, in terms of deep learning, neural networks, and so on. The fact is, when you apply systems or platform for clients, it's usually a combination of models and a combination of solutions that is being driven. So let's say you're analyzing communication at scale in a financial services institution across petabytes of data per week. Then yes, you are using some big data to even get the infrastructure and the Hadoop and the Spark and so on ready. So that is that part, but then you're using probably even some rule-based regular expression to do some maybe pre-filtering of in terms of what's relevant. Yeah, some methodology that's been around for a very, very long time. You might use some linear regression, some more easier random forest, some machine learning techniques, and then eventually build your neural network on this. So what I'm trying to say here is that any application in the real world is likely a combination of different flavors. So this kind of like, I have to try to separate different strands from each other. It's kind of makes sense, but then even between practitioners, those terms are often used interchangeably. So I would like you to kind of review some of the terminology and some of the diagrams on this, but then realize only gets you so far.
Yes. No, I think you make a very, very good point there. And interestingly, we held a Meet the Author session yesterday about the art of plain speaking and almost trying to take away some of the over sort of emphasis on jargon to actually get to the heart of what it is that is taking place in a particular situation. And I think with the clamor and the noise around the application of artificial intelligence, as you've just said there, stripping things back and really understanding what is being applied in what situation to solve what problem, and is going to be key to really understanding when and where these things will be needed and what is taking place. So that links to another question which I wanted to ask, which is what is artificial intelligence particularly good at, and hence why is there such a clamoring interest in the potential application of artificial intelligence related solutions within financial services at the moment?
Thank you. One thing I wanted to add for your answer there is that maybe some 6-7 years ago when I started, particularly in this direction, clients would be fascinated, and sometimes they would come to you and say, "Can you build me a AI solutions?" Yeah. As a vendor, you don't really want this clients. Yeah, that's good for, yes, we've built something, but you want the ones that really want to go into production and have thought that through, and then it's about making a difference in the clients, and it's not about using this or that flavor of AI. It's kind of like based on the data that you have, based on where you want to get to in terms of the degree of automation, precision recall, F1 scores, and so on. We could go into a lot of detail. You might choose a different approach there, but it's not like, oh, it has to be this. Yeah. Now, for your new question, for me personally, my parents are both language teachers, and my fascination with AI came for the ability to understand human language, and not just a, let's say, grammatically correct structure. You know, I had to learn English myself from a very early age, and but then understanding the meaning of individual words in a different context. So you need to be very nuanced, and that then allows to analyze unstructured information at scale. So we can come back to the example of petabytes of data in the email communication and chat conversation in some of the world's largest banks that is produced by the week. When you take all the attachments and all the Bloomberg and Reuters terminal in there, we can think about different applications. You can think about fraud or financial crime. Then the advantage is finding the needle in the haystack, the signal to the noise ratio. When you think about more about highlighting certain things for alerting, you could think about similar use cases in market insights, research insights, where you want to ingest all the information that is there, so kind of acting at scale, which was previously not possible before the arrival of Hadoop and Spark in big data infrastructure. But then you want to be using this scale to then tell you what's relevant. The human brain, when you start reading a book or a new text, you will eventually switch off. And by the time you get to the end of this, when it's about certain individuals or financial transactions or other means, you will have forgotten some of this. And the computer or the solution is much better at pulling things together that are not obvious, finding hidden connections, and then really making that unstructured data, whether it's an email, a text, or any other form of conversation, kind of meaningful. So kind of structuring in that and then allowing it to be analyzed.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And then on the basis then of where AI has application and where it solves potential problems, what then are companies and financial service establishments and organizations typically seeking to gain from your experience and exposure when you're in consultation with them when they're looking to undertake AI related projects?
Yeah, that was an interesting result also from the PwC AI in financial services study that I just completed mid in May, where we had about 150 or so participants. That was primarily now for the DACH countries, so Germany, Switzerland, Austria, to see what are the differences. And because I've been involved in engagements globally in terms of Asia and US as well, it was interesting to see what are the focus points here. And when I think back to the American banks, for example, some 5-6 years ago, a lot of them started on this journey towards AI, not necessarily for a drive for innovation or trying something new. It was sometimes around the regulatory fines that were getting to the billions, whether it was the FX collusion, LIBOR, but also anti-money laundering, some of the biggest fields for regulatory fines. So they were having to really get into control of their business much more than before. They had to look outside and find new ways to approach that. On the other hand, of course, the financial crisis led to, in some ways, the rise of fintech, where the banks also realized, maybe before the crisis, sometimes even at Morgan Stanley, it felt like we were developing solutions for 50% of the firm. But the banks needed to start to look outside and allow vendors to come in and solve some problems with them. And so the use cases in US were probably, at least for the banks, a lot around financial crime and fraud. But once they had established platforms for those burning issues, then really reusing those platforms to get contract management, terms and conditions, trade arbitrage, so many other use cases. Now, in the German-speaking part, when you compare it to use cases in China or US, we are still somewhat behind. We've seen some regulatory fines, but not at the same scale. So the approach that banks took, at least the ones we had participating in the study, so together with the insurers and asset managers, were more around improving efficiency, cost savings, and then some instances in terms of personalization and so on. So in US and China, kind of the view has moved on. Those standard use cases, when you think about chatbots or cost savings and automation, they're covered by RPA and very other means. So now the AI journey there has moved on to really develop entirely new business model, combine it with blockchain, go and secure other rounds of funding for a completely new bank. So we're seeing more of this, but there's definitely a different approach to the whole topic here than it would be, for example, in the UK, or even more so than for US and China.
Interesting. So what you're describing there is that the potential benefits are really extremely broad and can be applied across the spectrum, from efficiency to revenue uptick to compliance, as you say, to risk. So it's far and wide, and can be basically biased towards the need or the burning platform according to the user and the priority there. And also what you're describing, which I think is equally interesting, is that the geographic bias is also differentiated as well. So you're seeing, from your experience as well, different regional developments and different perhaps progress being achieved across the different regions as well, which again is really interesting, which then I suppose links a little bit to another thing that I wanted to ask, which is how mature would you say then adoption of AI is in financial services? Because linking to a question or a statement that you made a little earlier when we started the conversation, you said that some elements of AI is still 10 to 15 years from being fully developed, whereas others are perhaps a little bit more pervasive. So on a general level, I mean, are we still just at the start of the journey, or are we some way further down the line?
We are at the start of it when we talk about Germany, Austria and Switzerland, maybe a little bit more in Switzerland than we are in Germany, at least according to my study. But we are a lot further ahead when we talk about China and US. This is a generic statement, but that was also backed by the 150 plus participants. I think what we should do there is to really highlight some examples of countries and governments who have done really well in this, and some of the surprising examples we heard talking to these 150 experts, many of them with a really international background. One of them was Israel, that the government does not only kind of really support startups in that way, but really has a general program for the whole population to dive deep into artificial intelligence. Canada was also mentioned, of course, in that regards, but then also some of the investment regimes, even within Europe, where let's say for the German market, there is a program and you can get funding for research in AI. I think where UK, and I was part of the all parliamentary group for AI in House of Lords as an attendee for quite some time. I think where the government in the UK, for example, has shown longer interest is not only the research and the academic side, but really making it applied, bringing it into practice, bringing it to life, building companies. And I think what we still need to do for whole of Europe is to come up with some more incentives on entrepreneurs and tax regimes that would allow us to go anywhere close to where China is at. Of course, we are comparing apples and oranges here, but I still would like to make this example. Some of you might know this, but some of the larger Chinese cities like Shanghai, they have their own $25 billion investment plan in AI over the next 5 years. Now, for Germany, from the last announcement, we are at 3 billion total. Yeah, and I don't know where the UK is at and where we are in Europe. There's certainly moving pieces when you've seen the announcements on Gaia X on a shared cloud, shared and secure cloud base, and also in terms of the data standards. But we are still at a small scale, and then we can kind of find our own niche in this world where maybe we should have more ethical concerns, we should have some more maybe reasons that really hold us back, but for good reasons. But we still need to find this place, because I think otherwise, just as it happened in the 90s, where in Europe we somehow decided, oh, it's okay if I use a browser from the US, and if I use an ISP from the US, and well, my operating system can also be American. There's nothing wrong with this, but we either have the decision to make to play an active part in this, or we will essentially take commodity from the likes of Google, Alibaba, Microsoft, and others. So we will be dependent on other people to provide you with what we really need, or we decide to do more of our own research and incentivize that research. So the answer, the brief one, is really depending on the country and on the firm, and then of course depending on what we said earlier in terms of the client, depending on the readiness of the data, how much of that they have centrally available, what use cases, data privacy, and so on. You would then recommend different use cases to the specific clients based on their maturity level.
That's a very comprehensive answer, but also very well explained. So thanks for that. I want to come back in a minute to the question linked around the sort of the ethical considerations, because that's frankly a conversation that we could have a whole call on separately. But I do want to touch on that. But just linking and maybe staying with the subject of the regulatory support, not necessarily purely from the investment side, but maybe looking at it more from the general acceptance levels around supporting the artificial intelligence enabled solutions. There's clearly been progress, and quite significant progress, in key jurisdictions over the last 12 to 18, even 24 months. Is that come about through any specific breakthrough in the way in which the technology is being delivered or provided? And I want to reference here a number of people who may be somewhat familiar with artificial intelligence will have heard of phrases like black box AI, white box AI, the notion of explainability, for example. Have there been step changes in the way in which the AI is performing that is giving confidence to regulators to support the development and also the acceptance of these sorts of technologies that is helping?
Yes, I would say very much so. But that's just been, even for me in these 7 years, has been the perspective there has changed dramatically. I mean, when I was London-based but working globally, I had a lot of exchange with the local regulators, such as some things with Bank of England that are in public domain, but also others, but then also with the European ones, but also then in Asia. So I think I've got a fairly broad perspective on how the regulators have changed. I would say that for me, in the past, FCA or UK has been really one of the global leading regulators in terms of adopting a sandbox approach to really understand fintech, but then in succession also regtech, and then also some of the technologies that is being implemented and used. So the regulator has decided that they will provide some of their resources to give guidance to new companies in that field, whether that are challenger banks or vendors or other providers. And then other jurisdictions like Singapore and Australia to some degree have gone in a similar way, where they're applying some kind of sandbox. That meant that over time, these regulators have picked up a lot of knowledge. And I would say that my conversations that I used to have with global regulators some 7 years ago on this topic to now have changed dramatically. Even a couple of years ago, at least for UK and some others, when we met with the regulator using some of our data scientists, they equally came to the table with data scientists, and experts could have a really detailed technical discussion in terms of which models they used and what the results were. And there was a lot of interest, and it was a like-for-like discussion. That is not the case with all the regulators that we have in Europe. Yeah, some of them I have yet to meet some data scientists in there. For others, they have built up some teams, but
Yes.
there's maybe some delay factor. But what you see from a vendor perspective is that sometimes on behalf of one of the institutions you're working with, you're helping the institution to defend those new models that you build. Yeah, the models are way superior. I've seen in my career anything from factor 2 to 40 outperformance of a rule-based model, depending on how good the data is and how close the use case is. So you're helping the client to defend it, and you can very quickly tell based on the questions that the regulator is asking in terms of whether they actually have the capacity and the data scientists on their side to really dive deep into this, or whether you have to break it down further. Now, for some areas, at least as far as I know, for Europe, we are still slow in adapting, let's say, machine learning for areas like credit risk, or where it's about providing credit decisions, because we still want more transparencies, and we wouldn't allow the machine there to take over completely. But in Asia, on the other hand, I've met companies in Singapore who are doing pricing based on social media profiles. So you have a very wide range depending on where you look. It's more a case of, we know that the technology is there. We know it works in some jurisdictions. Is it ethically always the best solution? I think we come to that a bit later. But I think the regulators in Europe, at least, they will, for certain areas of financial crime, they're kind of looking to, they have a broader understanding when you can present the results in a statistical way, precision and recall and so on. Regardless of the models that you're using, it's more about the results. For other areas like credit risk, like we said, there's still more a reluctance to change the approach. But I think it's proven elsewhere that it can work. It's more a case of when it's kind of fully approved to be used for this particular use cases.
Yes, no, that again, I completely follow the logic there, and also from personal experience, I've seen some of the improvements, and also the warming of appetite on some of those different levels that you've just described. So on the basis then that the technology is becoming more understood, on the basis then that the regulators are becoming more amenable to the acceptance, where you have seen resistance or a level of unwillingness from financial service providers to adapt AI, what are the typical barriers or the blockers that you're seeing preventing take-up? Are there any common themes that you've noted?
Yeah, for sure. What I found fascinating, I mean, for me, I've been in AI, so I'm kind of biased, for the last 7 years. It's something that I truly believe in, and that I have seen change the world, and not only in financial services, but also in healthcare, or trying to prevent human trafficking, and many other areas that I find inspirational. So I'm kind of biased. So I'm trying to take myself out of this. But what's interesting, particularly as part of the study, was that the high importance that the senior leadership gives topics like AI. So a lot of, let's say, also articles, but also announcements and so on. But this doesn't always convert into making their institutions, let's say, AI savvy, or bringing it to the full flow. And I think the blockers that we've seen, where sometimes it's about the communicating it down in the organization, but then more real is also still the lack of available data. When I say available here, I don't mean this data doesn't exist at all. I mean nobody has gone through the different silos and put it somewhere centrally and give them access to data scientists to actually look at it. It's somewhat still the budget constraint, at least for the German-speaking countries, where yes, AI is seen as a very hot topic and an important topic, but there's still other things that are sometimes overriding that innovation path and kind of the topics we discussed earlier. But it's also the lack of AI skills on employees. I think there's some other countries have build up a wider academic network and wider network of leading academic institutions on this. So it's kind of around the hiring of talent. What I've also seen, though, also in leading top global banks, sometimes that the hiring comes before the data is available or some of the culture has been implemented. So yes, these blockers we're talking about, it's really some kind of a maturity model where each factor influences each other. That means that, yes, I can hire 20 best graduates from Imperial College or UCL in data science, machine learning. I can put them somewhere, but then what data do I give them access to? Do I take 6 months to give them the right interesting use cases to work with? Do I create a community of data scientists? Do I kind of acknowledge that they have slightly different goals and slightly different approach? Do I create something that is really sustainable and keeps those people in the firm? Yeah, they might be attracted initially, but I really have to keep them by giving them the right challenges and so on. So there's a lot of those things that work in combination. It's not just one thing is missing and we can't progress. It's usually that thing is solved, now on to the next one.
Yes, yeah, it's more interlinked and more multidimensional, as you're rightly saying there, and a fascinating challenge, certainly for a number of banks that are trying to almost redesign themselves and reorganize themselves institutionally to compete with perhaps some of the more forward-thinking technology firms that have been at the more cutting edge of some of these sorts of areas a little longer, and as a consequence have shaped, for example, culture, organizational design, have met with some of these challenges earlier and perhaps are a little bit more nimble around how they address these things. But I think that's what we're all observing at the moment, this changing landscape in which everyone's trying to reorganize themselves accordingly. But we're racing through the time, Michael. It's fascinating to hear your insights and views on some of these things. And I mentioned earlier, I wanted to just briefly touch on the topic of sort of the ethical dimension around the deployment of AI. I recall from a couple of senior management conferences where I attended back in my days with my previous bank, where our former CEO had stood on the stage and spoke quite openly and quite enthusiastically about the potential for new technology, and in which he was referring to AI, to comprehensively take out significant numbers of people from the processing of transactions and monitoring and operational overhead. So linked to that, and from an ethical perspective, to what extent do you feel that businesses or even governments have a responsibility to taper the introduction of some new AI technology if, as predicted, software is eating the world, and the results are perhaps a little bleak for so many jobs, down the line as is being predicted?
Yeah, and in terms of data is the new oil, I think there's a couple of comments I like to make on this. I mean, for one, I personally, in my own line of work, I always felt that the most successful implementations were around when we worked with the senior leadership, but then we took the whole team with us. It was not really about replacing people, and we both know there's endless studies on, is AI replacing people, and the answer is probably just like we heard with the maturity, that it really depends on country and where you are in this journey. So for me, this kind of replacing has not really played a role as such. It's kind of making the existing team of 300, if you want, or the existing team so much more efficient in doing the job, taking them with you on that journey while you implement, and then showing them how kind of their future role would look like. So I don't think the banks reduced staff as such, but they did kind of allow their team to kind of delegate some of the routine tasks and then follow their, let's say, investigations to a much more detailed level, see things that they didn't previously see, have more customer contacts when it was around the topic of personalization or chatbots, do a more holistic research when it was about market research. So I personally don't feel that, at least in my line of work, the business case I was used to making was around seeing something else, that you couldn't previously see the signal through the noise. It wasn't around replacing an army of people. I think that is, for me, more maybe closer to the RPA or the robotic process automation, or maybe aligned to some of the efficiency focus we have here. But that's not what I've observed. And I think this is also how, I think if you really take the broad mass of people with you, so middle management, the users on that journey, I think you will be more successful implementing AI as an organization, because you gain the trust from the beginning by involving that. But more maybe for the ethical perspective outside of my personal experience. I mean, we as PwC recognize that for many countries, we come kind of to the second wave now of AI. I mean, the people acknowledge it does work and it has certain maturity now that certain countries in terms of US, Asia, and so on, quite ahead of the game. They have implemented kind of the first wave of solutions now, and this is maybe also particularly good focus for Europe. The focus should be also on the responsible AI and on the ethical AI. And as PwC, we released a whole framework on this where you can either with your own resources or with our help test your models for bias, robustness, and many other things to kind of really see what have I implemented here? Do I really keep this kind of unbiased? Do I work in an ethical way? How can I improve this? And some of them, those standards that we have released, are now being adopted by some of the governments as a best practice, working with some of the global organizations there. So I think really once you have gone the journey and really discovered some of the potential of the AI, it's then a step to go back and really audit what you've done and go through a lot more detail. In some cases, I felt that for some jurisdictions where the solutions are not there or not so secure, it would be certainly it would have been great to start with responsible AI and ethical AI, but sometimes it's more the question is you really need to get started now. If we're not getting started for Europe, we have the scenario that I described earlier, then we depend on external suppliers, and we have to trust them to do the ethical part and the bias part and all of this for us. Yeah. So at the moment, we can still have the choice to decide for ourselves. If we are saying, oh, AI is essentially a bad thing and we are not using it because we have these and these concerns and so on, then I think we are giving in to letting in the future, in 5 years out, being dependent on other solutions. So this is kind of like my comparison to the internet, or the internet is there. It's there for good and for bad. It depends how people use it. And the same way I think is true for AI. It's got tremendous power, but also in the wrong hands, right? So we need to make sure that we understand it. That's the first thing, but then also use it for the good and for the right use cases in our frame.
Very good. Look, I think that's a fantastic way to bring this to a close. Actually, we're a little after the 40 minutes, but I think that's a tremendous summary and very, again, comprehensive sort of wrap up of again a topic which I mentioned we could probably hold an entire call on, Michael. So thank you for those further thoughts. And what I'd suggest is that we can potentially continue to explore and dig into some of those things in the digital hangout, which we'll look to move into next. So just in terms of wrap up, firstly, I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Michael. So my very sincere thanks to you for all of the insights and all of the conversational comments. We have recorded this session, and a link to that video will be shared via email. Please visit ditto.tv/mtd straight after this webinar ends, where Michael, myself, and hopefully you will be able to continue the conversation, ask any questions, pass any comments. For more information and for a copy of today's slides, or to discuss any of the topics covered, please get in touch with Ditto on control@ditto.tv. On screen now, you will see the other events we have happening throughout the day. And until then, just again to wrap up, thank you very much indeed for attending today. It's been our very great pleasure to host. And again, once again, Michael, thank you very much indeed for your time and for sharing all of your thoughts and insights today. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Andy. It's been a pleasure. Meet you in the separate session.
There you go. Thank you.